Welcome, everyone. I am delighted that you joined us for today's MTI Research Snaps webinar, Addressing Freight Emissions in San Jose, 7 Objectives to Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions, which explores strategies for the City of San Jose to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from freight. My name is Dr. Hilary Nixon, and I am the Deputy Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State. MTI leads 3 multi-university competitively selected consortia: the Mineta Consortium for Transportation Mobility, funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation; the California State University Transportation Consortium, funded by the Road Repair and Rehabilitation Act of 2017, otherwise known as California's Senate Bill 1; and the Climate Change and Extreme Events Training and Research Program, funded by the Federal Railroad Administration. MTI's mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. As you will learn in today's webinar, even though freight represents about 1/3 of transportation's climate-damaging greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., many local climate action plans and freight plans put little emphasis on freight emissions reduction strategies. This research presents strategies for the City of San Jose to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from freight and explores how other cities can learn from San Jose. Our speaker today is MTI Research Associate Dr. Serena Alexander, who is an Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at San Jose State University and, importantly, a visiting scholar at the U.S. Department of Transportation's Climate Change Center. Her research primarily focuses on developing and implementing cutting-edge strategies to address climate change. During the webinar, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can submit them through the chat or Q&A feature. We are recording this webinar today, and the link will be available to view on our website and social media pages shortly. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, Serena. I now turn over the floor to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nixon, for the introduction. And hello and welcome everyone to this wonderful webinar about freight emissions. So today we are going to focus on 7 objectives related to freight emission reductions. So let's get started. The picture in the background is probably familiar to you. That's most likely how our front porch looks like these days during the holiday season, when we have ordered so many online packages. Of course, when you order online, there are a variety of reasons for that. We order online because it is convenient, because there are many options for us that are available, better prices that are available, or because we just got used to ordering things online during the pandemic as a safer, better alternative for our families. When we order online, however, we seldom think about the unintended consequences of freight. Freight represents about 30% of total transportation emissions. It also leads to significant quantities of air pollutants that impact human health and environmental health. At the same time, freight accounts for 13% of all transportation-related fatalities in the United States. So we do know that all of these consequences of freight can be addressed through strategies at various levels of government. Today, we are going to focus on emissions impacts of freight. This work was completed as a part of a project that lasted for one year, and my students were involved in this process as well. The goal of the project was to help the City of San Jose with developing and implementing strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from freight transportation. We also wanted to inform other local agencies seeking to reduce their own community-wide freight emissions. The method for the project involved, first and foremost, a geospatial analysis of freight data in San Jose, as well as the larger Santa Clara County. That often is the first step to understand where freight emissions are coming from and how they're distributed across your jurisdiction. Usually, we see that certain communities, disadvantaged communities, are disproportionately harmed by freight emissions. So it's important to know where the problem is coming from. Today's presentation is mostly going to focus on the second part, which is a comprehensive analysis of literature on freight emission reduction strategies, and also case studies from real-world experiences and strategies that have been employed internationally to reduce freight emissions. We also went through an extensive consultation with professionals at the City of San Jose, who helped us determine whether these strategies met the needs at the City of San Jose, and also were reflecting the community values and other transportation goals. So our results showed that there are 7 objectives. So think of these objectives as areas of focus. The first thing is managing freight demand and addressing consumer expectations. Freight demand growth means that greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental problems associated with freight will continue to increase under the business as usual scenario. The question is, how can we manage freight demand growth and address consumer expectations of a fast, free, or low-price delivery of goods? Of course, there are many things in this area that are not under the control of cities, but there are certain things that cities can do to help. For example, land use planning to manage freight demand is a powerful tool that cities have to address freight demand. By land use strategies, we can shorten the distance that trucks drive, for example, to deliver goods. Other strategies in this area include off-peak delivery of goods as a transportation demand management strategy, encouraging the local production of goods, and working with service providers to add a green choice option. So, for example, combining several items into one single delivery. The second objective is utilizing low modes and multimodal solutions for freight. There are 2 major factors that should be considered. First is the selection of the most appropriate mode of freight transportation, and the second one is the optimization of multimodal operations. Selection of the most appropriate mode of transportation is actually pretty complex, because often one mode does not meet all of our important criteria. Take rail, for example. It is environmentally friendly and it's also very efficient. But at the same time, it is not as flexible or available or fast as some other options. Because of that, we have to use different modes of transportation for freight delivery. So things that we can do in this area include increased use of rail when possible, use of light modes of transportation, such as cargo bikes or light electric trucks to deliver freight, and multimodal optimization to ensure that we can optimize our resources. The next objective is about optimizing freight assets and environmental resources. This is actually a very economic objective, because it's about using what we already have effectively rather than building new things or purchasing new things. We are going to use our own environmental resources and the infrastructure available for this. There are several examples in this category. So how we can share city hubs and warehouses more effectively. Can we adjust truck size based on load and use truck space more effectively? How can we manage curb more effectively? And how we can encourage businesses to use less packaging will be in this category. The next objective is focusing on the last mile. One of the key takeaways from the research that we conducted was that the biggest opportunity for cities to reduce freight emissions is related to the last mile delivery. Trucks and vans that transport goods from regional distribution hubs to local businesses or homes contribute to freight emissions tremendously. There are several things in this category that cities can consider. Common carrier lockers, micro hubs, delivery robots, and cargo bikes will be in this category. The next objective is deploying alternative sources of fuel and energy efficiency measures. This is something that most people think is related to the federal government or higher levels of government, but there are certain things in this category that cities can do, such as zero or low emission delivery zones or green loading zones, and also even financial incentives for green freight. The next objective is about engaging the stakeholders and exploring collaboration opportunities. No single plan can be developed and implemented without effective, transparent, and inclusive engagement of stakeholders and community members. There are specific things that cities can do in this area. So, for example, they can establish a freight outreach group or a specific task force that focuses on freight. And also having equity discussions with community members is important. And lastly, developing a data sharing platform is extremely important. One challenge to transforming the urban freight system is limited data transparency in the logistics chain and also difficulties obtaining accurate and reliable freight data. Again, this is something that the federal government is working on and other levels of government are working on, but there are certain things that maybe cities can try to do. So, for example, exploring the feasibility of creating a secure data sharing platform where companies can share information about their green procurement practices with each other and the city would be helpful. In this case, companies will only have access to this data if they first share their data. So with those objectives in mind, there are several specific strategies that cities can incorporate. The first one is that freight impacts, especially emissions, should be integrated into municipal plans, such as climate action plans, as well as land use and new development decisions. You might think that this is an obvious strategy and all cities should have done this already, but you might be surprised to find out that how many climate action plans at the local level do not even mention freight or only talk about freight as another dimension and not specifically focusing on strategies for freight. There are also specific freight-specific plans that can be developed. Here you can see several examples of that. So LA Metro had a plan that you're seeing on the left-hand side. There's the City of Seattle Freight Master Plan, and also the Regional Multimodal Freight Plan developed by Denver Regional Council of Governments. So developing freight-specific plans and also integrating freight strategies into other relevant local plans is an important step. With the growth of e-commerce, municipalities should employ diverse strategy, ranging from land use strategies to encouraging off-peak deliveries and green choice alternatives to manage freight demand and address consumer expectations. It is important to consider a diverse set of strategies and not focus on one strategy as a silver bullet, because seldom that kind of strategy works, especially if it's not combined with other strategies. The next strategy is where appropriate, municipalities should utilize curb space to make freight loading and unloading more efficient and to encourage goods movement practices that minimize emissions. For example, we can introduce green loading zones for the exclusive use of zero or low emission commercial vehicles. Here on the left-hand side, you see a picture of that has been marked clearly for exclusive use of zero or low emission commercial vehicles. Also, municipalities should pilot solutions that focus on the last mile of deliveries to reduce emissions. As I mentioned earlier, last mile delivery is probably the best opportunity that cities have at the local level to address freight emissions. For example, municipalities can pilot test cargo bikes, delivery robots, micro hubs, and common carrier lockers. Here you can see an example of some of these. You probably have seen the Amazon lockers in your local grocery store. You might have seen these little delivery robots around the city of San Jose delivering food items. And also on the left-hand side, you can see a cargo bike that has been pilot tested across the nation in several cities already. Also, where applicable, municipalities can test the viability and effectiveness of restricted multi-use lane strategies, such as allowing low emissions freight vehicles in bus or bicycle lanes and restricting freight vehicles to the right lane. This is, of course, a context-sensitive strategy, and cities should first test to see whether it is politically viable, and it's something that the community would value and understand and want before, of course, moving forward with a permanent strategy related to this. But cities have a lot of control over, how roads are being used. So this might be one of the things that can be considered at a local level. Although strategies to advance alternative vehicle fuel and energy efficiency technologies are often pursued by higher levels of government, municipalities can play an important role in encouraging the use of alternative fuel and energy efficient measures by incentivizing green freight and efficiency measures, and also developing an alternative fuel readiness plan. So you can see here an example of San Diego Regional Alternative Fuel Readiness Plan. And the goal of this kind of plan is to determine the barriers that exist to alternative fuel adoption and also alternative fuel infrastructure. And that usually is the first step to successful deployment of alternative fuels. And that's something that can be done at the regional level or even at the local level. Municipalities should also engage in public-private partnership with freight companies and also local businesses, while also including other relevant stakeholders to enhance data transparency in the logistics chain, develop and adopt freight emission reduction strategies, and also accelerate the deployment of zero or low emission vehicles. Again, community engagement matters, and public-private partnerships with freight companies and local businesses can help cities jumpstart this process of developing and implementing freight emissions. Data availability is one of the biggest challenges in this area, in the area of freight. And of course, the data is available. It's just that sometimes not all cities can purchase some of the existing sources of data. And therefore, working with community members to gain access to the data that these companies might have will be beneficial. And lastly, municipalities should adopt strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emission from freight hubs and warehousing through technology tools, incentives, and logistics optimization. Again, sometimes warehouses and freight hubs are ignored when it comes to freight emission reduction, but there are certain things that can be done, especially because of the development of new technologies and new tools and new apps that can be used to optimize logistics and optimize freight delivery. So for example, we can minimize the amount of time that trucks wait in freight hubs, or we can also optimize the space in the trucks that are used. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Alexander, for those really compelling findings. I once again invite guests to submit questions using the Q&A feature. I see that one has come in that we will get to in just a second, but there were some questions that were submitted earlier during registration. And I think, Serena, I'm really interested in thinking about whether or not you see a greater focus on freight emissions recently. And if so, what factors do you think have contributed to that change in focus when we're talking about freight?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic was a wake-up call for many communities. We started to understand the importance of freight and how vulnerable freight can be, when it comes to global impacts, pandemics, climate change, and things like that. So one reason was just because we all of a sudden became aware of freight as an important aspect of our lives. But of course, we have seen greater focus on freight at the federal level. Implementation of bill, for example, has put a tremendous amount of emphasis on freight. Right now, states, for example, are required to develop state-level freight plans that address emissions and discuss emissions, and also address some other environmental impacts such as stormwater management or preservation of wildlife habitat. So that kind of emphasis came at all levels. At the local levels, communities started to realize how important freight was, and also started to kind of see the problems associated with freight. At the federal level, it became as a part of the climate policy an important aspect because it's about one third of emissions that come from transportation. At the state level, again, there's a greater focus on freight. So we are seeing more and more people at various levels are talking about freight, and that's a great thing because it has been ignored for a very long time.
Thank you so much. So starting to get some of our open questions in the Q&A. There's a question here, and you talked a little bit about the fact that we're dealing with there's federal strategies, state level strategies, but that local governments, particularly when it comes to land use planning, land use strategies, have a lot of control and authority within their local areas. And one of our questions is if you could talk a little bit about the actionable linkages between land use strategies and the goal of encouraging off-peak deliveries and green choice alternatives, and maybe even talk a little bit about what some of the benefits might be, for example, of off-peak deliveries.
So off-peak delivery has been adopted by freight companies as a way to cut costs. But of course, we also know that is a TDM strategy that can be readily incorporated into the city's TDM strategies. There are also other things related to land use planning that, of course, we have emphasized for a very long time. How can we develop denser communities with better access to jobs and amenities? And when we do that, of course, we can also optimize our freight delivery because then we can, for example, use a neighborhood micro hub, or we can use lockers as a way for people to optimize and expedite the freight delivery process. So the point really here is to think about freight and prioritize freight when we think about land use strategies, because traditionally we have thought about these things a lot as is related to passenger transportation, but if freight is incorporated, the impact is always greater.
Thank you so much. I know from looking through the participant list that there's a number of names I recognize who are local planners in our regional area. And I'm wondering, we know that there's funding available for bike plans, pedestrian plans, safety plans. Do you happen to know if there are funds or programs that are available that could help local agencies fund the preparation of these local focused freight plans?
Oh, that's a great question. I know that funding will be prioritized in this area at federal level because of the implementation of bill. I don't know of specific funding sources right now, but I do know that many people are working on that, including myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking for those who are interested in that, keeping an eye out on the grant opportunities coming through IIJA down the pipeline. I can imagine that this will be something that will be in there. So here's kind of an interesting question. I know that you didn't talk much about the GIS component of this work and the geospatial work, but there's a question from our audience members about the GIS data sets that you used to help identify the neighborhoods that were most impacted in San Jose. I wonder if you could give us a sense of what those data sets were.
So we used a variety of data sets. That part of work was predominantly done by my students as a part of a class activity. We used some of the data that City of San Jose had purchased. We also had some publicly available data sets. So for example, we used MFAC, which is available publicly. We used street light data, which the City of San Jose purchased. And so those were the main ones, but we also used, again, a variety of data sources for that. Right now, when it comes to data, there are many choices, but of course, some of them are expensive. So I would start with the existing sources of data and the ones that are readily available through the state of California. And then, of course, if the city can afford to purchase data, then that's the next step.
Great, thank you so much. So there's another question that kind of is a question related to what potential coordination is happening or could be happening between freight and public transit, and that there seems to be kind of a huge potential for alternative fueling hubs, if you could coordinate the management activities between those two groups.
So what strategies we can employ to do that?
Yeah, or what can you think of that would work better to help coordinate the relationship between freight and their needs as well as public transit, maybe related to fueling strategies?
Yeah, I think really the first step is to identify those areas, plan for both, and have discussions about it simultaneously. So one of the challenges that we have when it comes to freight or other areas is that we develop separate plans, and then there are usually separate entities who are responsible for the implementation of that plan. So better collaboration, better coordination between the different kinds of plans, whether that's about passengers or freight, would be extremely beneficial. And also thinking holistically about emissions. So climate action plans are actually a very good tool for that, because climate action plans do not discriminate against freight or passenger. They just talk about emissions as a whole. So sometimes using climate action planning process would be helpful to kind of start those discussions of how can we bring things together for a common purpose.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned and showed a picture in your presentation about cargo bikes. And in fact, for those of you, maybe Alvarina, if you got a chance, we do have an MTI research project on cargo bikes and a study that was done up in Oakland. So maybe we can throw the link in there if we've got a chance. But I want to tackle one of the questions, because one of our audience members is asked about if you know about what might be done or what might be being done to encourage the post office to adopt cargo bikes. This individual has seen this in Switzerland and Germany. And is this something that our US Postal Service or other local delivery carriers, whether that's UPS, FedEx, are considering cargo bikes?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know about the Postal Service specifically, but I do know that US DOT is considering strategies to reduce emissions from freight. And actually, cargo bikes are one of the things that are mentioned in the newest version of transportation decarbonization documents that we're preparing. So there will be more focus on this, of course, but it's something that cities have done and pilot tested. Oakland is an example. You can see many examples elsewhere. So there's clearly interest at the local level. But one of the requirements of that, so that's interesting when we think about transportation infrastructure and bike infrastructure. When we improve those will work also for things like cargo bikes. So many of these things are actually related. So when we improve on one of these things, then at the same time we improve the chances for the other options as well.
Great, thanks so much. And Alvarina, thank you for putting the link to that cargo cycle report in the chat for anyone who wants to take a look. So you also talked about data platforms and the importance of transparency with data so that we can figure out how to do things better. And one of our audience members asks a question, about how can cities get companies to share their delivery data via these kind of transparent? What might be some incentive structures that could be put in place, or what are some strategies you think there?
That's an excellent question. And I would say that starting that process might be a little bit challenging because companies are generally reluctant to share that kind of data. But the first step might be building trust and building a relationship with the freight companies. So when we talk about engagement, getting the companies engaged in the freight planning processes at the city level, that might be the first step to develop this trust. But once we build that relationship, then there are other things that can be done. So for example, one of the things that I mentioned during the presentation is that companies will like to have access to data. And they will only have access to data if they first share their data. So that's an incentive. for them to share data. There are also other kinds of incentives. Also, although if you look at the literature, you will see that we have to be cautious about what kind of incentives we provide. So if companies are concerned about being punished for if their data doesn't look good, then they will be reluctant to share that kind of data. It's really a process that starts with collaboration, engagement, building trust, and then working with them to see what are things that would also benefit them. So, for example, one of the things that I've heard about freight companies is that a lot of the times some of these processes are just done. One person is sitting there and tries to organize some of these freight deliveries, and it would be helpful if several companies were collaborating together to do that. So it's important for companies to understand some of the benefits. Can they save money if they do this? Would it be more effective for them? If they understand the benefits and they trust that this data will be used to help them, then they're naturally more inclined to share their data.
Right. We have hit the 30-minute mark on our webinar, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There was a couple of questions we couldn't get to, so I've put Dr. Alexander's email in the chat because I think that they'd be really great questions. You want to reach out to her directly. I'm sure she'd be more than happy to continue this discussion because I know it's an area she's passionate about. So I'd really like to thank Serena for joining us today. The final report from this is available on the MTI website for those who want to take a closer look. And we'll also make sure to put the chat in the link into the chat. And also just one more thing before we go, MTI recently published another one, a new report from Dr. Alexander that is titled Fragmented or Aligned Climate Action, Assessing Linkages Between Regional and Local Planning Efforts to Meet Transportation Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Targets. And this is an in-depth content analysis of plans and policies developed by 5 MPOs and 20 municipalities. And I really encourage you to take a look at that report as well and its findings, and to check it out. And we've put that link into the chat as well. So thank you all for your time and for your great questions. It was a really robust conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. Please join us at one of our next events coming up. You can get information on our website. And Dr. Alexander, thank you so very much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much for organizing it. And also thank you participants for being here.